Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's event is entitled Deciding Who is Worth Saving, American Universities and the Refugee Scholars of the Nazi Era, featuring Dr. Laurel Leff, author of Well Worth Saving, American Universities' Life and Death Decisions on Refugees from Nazi Europe, who will introduce a few of those scholars and explain how the backdrop of these fraught choices were made. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement, and this is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, were first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today we identify those crimes for what they are, mass atrocities and genocide, and these horrors continue to have devastating political, economic, social, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Our event today is part of the 2025-26 National Endowment for the Humanities and KHC Colloquium entitled Resistance, Resilience, and Reinvention, Artists and Academics Escaping Nazism, and it's co-sponsored by 10 organizations around the country, and they include the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Holocaust Resource and Education Center of Keene University, the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Reef Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution at Christopher Newport University, the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University, the Queens College Center for Jewish Studies, the Center for Genocide and Human Rights Research in Africa and the Diaspora at Northeastern Illinois University, and the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University. I'd like to thank our colleagues from the Media Services and Digital Transformation Departments, including Phil Roncaroni and Jesse Pina, as well as Barana Soman, the KHC's Museum Coordinator, for their help in producing today's event. So before we begin, a reminder for those of you in the room, if you could please turn off your cell phones. And after the presentation, we'll host a brief Q&A. For those of you in the room, we'll pass around a microphone. And for those of you watching online, please be sure to drop your Q&A button, your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So to kick things off, it's my pleasure to introduce one of the KHC NEH faculty fellows this year, Dr. Beth Cunahan. Dr. Cunahan has been a professor in QCC's English department for the past 24 years, where she's active in teaching and coordinating high-impact practices in college and university service. Dr. Cunahan's scholarship includes numerous national two-year College Association presentations on nature-infused curriculum and reading in the community college classroom. She was a corresponding co-author of a chapter about the QCC Common Read Initiative in the 2017 text, What is College Reading? She's especially devoted to first semester QCC students taking part in the college's learning communities, service learning, the Common Read, as well as organizing the KHC-funded Welcome Read Initiative. Dr. Cunahan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to thank you to Dr. Cohen and Barana Soman, to Jesse and to Phil, my colleagues, Professor Cimino and Dr. Zelser, for working on organizing the colloquium together, our attendees in person and online, both present online and people watching in the future, and Professor Laurel Leff for coming today to present Deciding Who Was Worth Saving, American Universities and the Refugee Scholars of the Nazi Era, our third lecture in the series, Resistance, Resilience, and Reinvention, Artists and Academics Escaping Nazism. In 1933, as Hitler consolidated power, thousands of Jewish and dissident artists and academics faced persecution, not only from Nazi anti-Semitism, but also from the regime's totalitarian control over culture and society. As Nazism spread, many painters, writers, filmmakers, and scholars sought refuge in Europe and the United States, though restrictive and anti-Semitic and immigration policies often blocked their escape. This series explores the history, contributions, and lasting impact of those who escaped, and with this presentation, those who did not. Additionally, the series highlights the resistance and creative works that emerged from their survival. Please join me in a moment of silence in remembrance of those who did not escape the Nazi religious, intellectual, and artistic persecution, and those impacted by the Holocaust. Thank you. Please join me now in welcoming our speaker today. Laurel Leff is Professor Emerita of Journalism and former Associate Director of Jewish Studies at Northeastern University. Her book, well worth saving, American Universities, Life and Death Decisions on Refugees from Nazi Europe, Yale University Press, was a finalist for a 2020 National Jewish Book Award. Her previous book, Buried by the Times, The Holocaust in America's Most Important Newspaper, Cambridge University Press, was chosen as the best media history book of 2005 by the American Journalism Historians Association and best history book of 2005 by Forward Reviews. So welcome, Laurel Leff.
Thank you, Beth. Can everybody hear me? Am I speaking loud enough? Excellent. Okay, get the slides up first, and then I'll get going. Thank you very much for inviting me here, and thank you for doing this series. I mean, I think this is a very important aspect, particularly of the earlier stages of the Holocaust, and it's addressed a lot, but it still could be addressed even more. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate to you who came here in person and those of you who are online. Within days of Germany annexing Austria in March 1938, biologist Leonore Brescher was fired from a position at Vienna's famed Institute for Experimental Biology. She was dismissed, along with 15 other Jewish employees who made up half the staff, including its founder and director, and all its department heads. And you can see Leonore right there in the middle of the first row. The 52-year-old Brescher, who studied the environmental and hereditary factors that produced color changes in the cabbage white butterfly, and I said all of that because she was very devoted to her butterflies, knew her only hope was to immigrate as a scholar to either Great Britain or, better yet, the United States. Born in Romania, she couldn't expect to enter under the American quota for her country, which stood at 603 people a year. Brescher, however, had another avenue of escape. Section 4D of the 1924 immigration law provided what were called non-quota visas to those who were professors at institutions of higher learning abroad and who planned to continue the vocation of professor in the United States. There was no limit on the number of professors who could be admitted. But the State Department interpreted 4D to require an immigrant to have a job offer from an American university to obtain a non-quota visa. So Brescher wrote to every organization, colleague, friend, and acquaintance she could think of to help her obtain an American university job. She was not alone. From 1933 until immigration basically ended in 1942, thousands of desperate scholars besieged American universities. Some universities made offers to refugee scholars, but many more did not. Even with an offer in hand, the State Department found other grounds upon which to deny visas. All told, only 944 professors received non-quota visas between 1933 and 1941. The primary American committee to help rescue European scholars, the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Scholars, received over 6,000 appeals and ended up supporting just 335 scholars. This reality changes the popular and scholarly narrative that America saved Europe's intellectual elite. The United States did indeed welcome Albert Einstein and Enrico Fermi, Hannah Arendt and Herbert Marcuse, Rudolf Carnap and Richard Current. But in welcoming America is only part of the story. The other part, the more common part, is reflected in Leonore Brescher's experience as a dedicated biologist hampered by her age, her gender, and her religion. For every intellectual who survived and thrived, thousands did not. Of course, not all of those who were not hired were thrust into the maw of the final solution. Some managed to immigrate through the regular visa system. Some went to other countries. Great Britain, Turkey, Palestine, and South Africa were common destinations, particularly for academics. Others managed to escape to neutral countries, such as Switzerland or Sweden, and wait out the war there. But many found themselves in concentration camps and ghettos, in hiding, shot in ditches, or dying in extermination centers. What I'd like to do today is explain why American universities considered so many scholars, like Leonore Brescher, not worth saving, in the unfortunate phrase of the time. So why focus on universities? Academics and professionals were among the first to be officially persecuted by the Nazi government. In April 1933, a little over 2 months after the Nazi regime assumed power, the German government decreed that all members of the Jewish race were to be dismissed from civil service positions. Because all German universities were state-run, that meant 1,200 Jews and non-Aryans were dismissed from German universities. Non-Aryans were defined as those who had one Jewish grandparent, regardless of whether they or their parents or their grandparents had converted to another religion. There initially were exceptions for those who had served in or had lost a father or son in the Great War. Those exceptions disappeared, and another 800 were fired by the end of 1935. On the other side of the ocean, American academics were more likely than other Americans to have professional ties to Europe. So they heard about the dismissals almost immediately through personal contacts as well as from reading newspapers. Alvin Hansen, who was a University of Minnesota economist, wrote in 1933, "I have received several letters from friends in Germany who have been discharged from academic positions under the Nazi regime and who are in serious distress." Hansen then ticked off the names of those who had been discharged. "All of these men are known to me personally, and they are very able in their respective fields." But the third and most important reason to focus on universities is that they held one of the few lifelines for European Jews. If an institution of higher education or religion offered someone a position, they were not subject to the extremely strict country-by-country quotas. Only 25,957 immigrants a year were allowed to enter the United States from Germany, and that was actually at the very high end. That was the second highest. As you saw, Romania only allowed in 603 immigrants a year, and Poland, which was a big country, only allowed 6,000. And there were hundreds of thousands, at least initially, trying to get out of Germany, and then literally millions trying to get out of Europe generally. If you received one of these prized non-quota visas, your wife, and they did mean wife, and I'll explain that a bit later, and minor children could immigrate too. So how was this done? How did you get yourself a non-quota visa, or at least put yourself in the position of getting a non-quota visa? In the effort in the United States, and some of this was happening in other countries as well, occurred at 3 different levels. Individual faculty members, such as economist Alvin Hansen, would hear about a friend or a colleague who had lost a job, first at German universities, then Austrian, Czech, Italian, Polish, French, Belgian, and Dutch universities. And that's important. There's often a feature exclusively on Germany, but this very quickly became a European problem, not just a German problem. They would then tap networks to see if they could find the best scholars a job. So that was one way, the individual contact. It was also done by discipline. Sometimes entire disciplines rallied around hiring refugee scholars, or even one individual scholar. An example of that is Alfred Philippson. He was a geographer at the University of Bonn. He was 77 years old. He lost his position because he was Jewish. In November 1941, relatives learned that Philippson and his family had been evacuated from Bonn and were awaiting deportation to Poland. American geographers raised enough money to enable Swiss geographers to transport Philippson to and support him in Switzerland. But at the last minute, the funds could not be deposited in a Swiss bank, and Philippson, his wife, and daughter were deported to Theresienstadt, where they were actually given special treatment as a result of the intervention of geographers and survived. So individuals, disciplines, but then there also were national organizations. Some were existing organizations, such as the Rockefeller Foundation and the American Association of University Women. The Rockefeller Foundation made this effort because it had decided to move money it had been using to fund scholars in Germany to fund these refugee scholars in the United States. The American Association of University Women made the commitment primarily because of this one woman. And I'd be happy if people wanted to ask me more about her later, but her name was Esther Kochen-Brunauer. This was not her job at the AAUW, but she decided she was going to try to get as many women scholars out as possible. There were also national organizations that were created specifically to help scholars and intellectuals, such as the University in Exile that was affiliated with the New School for Social Research, and eventually the Exile University became its graduate faculty, and it hired 167 scholars. The Emergency Committee, which I mentioned before, was formed in 1933. It immediately recognized it would face two problems in trying to get refugee scholars hired. The first was with over 2,000 American professors having lost their jobs between 1930 and 1933 because of the Great Depression. American universities were not eager to hire scholars from abroad. And the second was anti-Semitism in the academy. So the Emergency Committee tried to overcome these problems in a couple of different ways. First, it made its grants be only for temporary positions, 2-year appointments. They were made at no cost to the university. They were funded half by the Emergency Committee and then some other organization, most typically the Rockefeller Foundation. They focused on senior scholars who are less likely to compete with American professors. And they pitched it as a benefit to the university, or to the departments, that you were hiring someone who had great credentials, who would actually improve your department. And they made sure that the requests came from the universities. They were not actually placing people. They were waiting for universities to make an offer, and then they would fund those positions. Now, you might have noticed that there's one level missing, and that is the university administration. That's not an oversight. No university president was a leader in the effort. The basic posture seemed to be they were not eager to hire refugees, but were not totally obstructionist either. Alvin Johnson, who is the president of the New School, explained in 1940, it is very undesirable to approach presidents or deans directly. It is, I think, a good rule with respect to presidents and deans, let sleeping dogs lie. So why was this done? Why were universities even making these offers to begin with, especially in the middle of a depression? There were two reasons, and they were often in tension. The first was literally for the sake of Western civilization. There was a sense that these scholars had great knowledge, had done wonderful research, and it would be a loss to Western society if they were not brought to the United States in order to be able to continue their work. And then there were humanitarian reasons. Then it was just, these people were suffering, as we'll see. They were at some point in danger of being murdered. And so the reason to bring them over was for these humanitarian reasons. I have to say that although both of these played out during this period, the first rationale, that it was important to save these scholars for their contributions, tended to be the primary one. And that's because this was conceptualized by most universities as a hiring decision. So the academics went into hiring mode, in some ways no different than other hiring decisions made then or now. They looked at the person's scholarship, how productive they were, what the quality was. They looked at their teaching. They looked at their ability to fit into the faculty, and that was how they decided who they were going to hire. And most universities, and this is where it gets more tricky, maintain those standards even though the faculty making the decisions for the most part understood what rejection meant. In the 1930s, refusing to hire a scholar meant he or she probably could not emigrate and thus would have to face a life of privation and intense suffering in Europe. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, rejection often meant death. The years-long German refugee problem had become an international crisis as Germany seized nations throughout Europe, adding millions of Jews to those seeking to emigrate. The emigration stampede and the filling of the quotas in 1939, at least from Germany, made non-quota visas particularly precious. At the same time, the stakes for those who couldn't leave rose, which American academics knew. And here's what they knew. Americans knew when the scholars they were trying to help were in camps. A standard form used by the American Council for Emigres in the Profession, for example, included the name Ernst Emil Schweitzer, who is described on the form as a recognized scholar in his field, having published several books on jurisprudence. It then listed his languages, his references, and his present address, Camp de Gurs in the Pyrenees, France, Lot C, Barrack 12, followed by additional remarks. His life is in danger on account of enormous loss of weight through undernourishment. It was not possible to discover what happened to Schweitzer. They knew when scholars were in hiding. In October 1940, the Rockefeller Foundation was considering assisting Gottfried Salomon, who had been a sociologist at the University of Frankfurt. Foundation officials knew Solomon was hiding near Gard in the Rhone Valley, where he is living with friends under assumed name. The New School actually hired Solomon, and he escaped France in 1941. They knew generally that deportations were taking place. In advising Harvard Observatory head Harlow Shapley, who was very involved in the Harvard attempt to hire more scholars, he was trying to get an astronomer out of France. A Rockefeller Foundation explained that for foreign Jews, and this is a quote, as you may know, are now being deported en masse to Eastern Poland. They knew when individual scholars were deported, including specific information about their journey. The Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton recorded in a short memo dated February 6, 1942, the whereabouts of Ludwig Berwald. He had formerly head of the mathematics department at the German University in Prague, and his wife Hedwig. And this is a quote. Our information of April 4th, 1940, that Professor Berwald was in England was a mistake. He stayed on in Prague, and he and his wife have now been deported to Poland. Helpfully, perhaps hopefully, the memo listed the Berwald's new address in the Lodz ghetto. And here you can see their address in the Lodz ghetto. Both Ludwig and Hedwig Berwald died in the ghetto in 1942 within 6 months of their arrival. And they knew what deportation meant. UC Berkeley law professor Max Radin wrote in June 15, 1940 about fellow law professor and law dean Max Fleischmann. What he is threatened with now, Radin wrote, is deportation to some wretched hole in Poland where his chances even of physical survival are extremely slight. Fleischmann committed suicide before he was deported. Now, this is not to say that every faculty member who decided not to offer a refugee scholar position knew that this meant a life was in danger. But it does mean that most everyone regularly trying to place scholars had access to this information. So if American universities were making hiring decisions, what were the hiring criteria? Well, in a nutshell, The candidate had to be well-connected and world-class. He or she, but mostly he, couldn't be too old or too young, too left or too right, and certainly not too Jewish. So we'll go through these criteria. Well-connected. It was obviously easier if American professors already knew the refugee scholar. Some had made academic visits to the United States or had encountered Americans in international conferences. It was helpful to be world-class. Almost all the organizations, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Emergency Committee, the New School, agreed that the priority had to be on saving world-class men. Vladimir Yankelevich for example, was considered, and this is a quote, among the most brilliant and lucid philosophical writers of the younger generation and very well worth saving. The phrase that was used by, in this context, Horace Callan, although the phrase was used frequently. Part of the Rockefeller Foundation explicit criteria said in November 1940, are the men of real distinction so that their extinction would be a genuine loss to the scholarly world? We do not see much point to bringing over people who are merely run-of-the-mill. At least initially, the Rockefeller Foundation literally graded scholars, A minus, B plus, etc. And other groups circulated lists of disposed scholars and asked scholars in their disciplines to comment on each of them. A neuropathologist in Munich, for example, received a list of 17 psychiatrists. His comments ranged from one of the best, a real savant, for Gabriel Steiner, to an egoist, talks too much but is not as bad as he seems, for Robert Wartenberg, to has written nothing in the past 10 years, just a routine man, for Franz Kramer. They would also give CVs to American scholars to assess their abilities. The files are filled with dismissive notes, such as for Ignacy Meyerson, he's there on the left, a French physician and psychologist who was described as not a first-rate scientist, but a very nice man. Erwin Goodenough, a Yale history professor, tried to be careful in evaluating Edmund Stein, a professor at Warsaw Institute of Jewish Studies. I do not in any way want in any way to appear to damn Dr. Stein, for he may be a person of great promise, Goodenough wrote. Still, his assessment was quite damning. I know of Stein only as the author of 2 studies of Philo of Alexandria that are competent and thorough, but not brilliant, the sort of thing which good young men in Germany turn out almost automatically. Steiner never received an American position. He was imprisoned in the Warsaw Ghetto. His work for textile workshop gave him immunity for deportation, but after his wife and son were transported to Treblinka, he refused an offer of refuge on the Aryan side, and in January 1943, he was transported first to Travniki and from there to Majdanek, where he was murdered. For others, the problem wasn't that they were evaluated and found lacking, but they couldn't be evaluated at all. Hugh Babb, who was head of the Boston University Business School, couldn't find anyone to evaluate Jerzy Finkelkraut, a Polish jurisprudence scholar. Who among our legal scholars reads Russian or Polish? Babb then worried about Finkelkraut's fate, noting that his last known address was in Warsaw. I suppose that his home address would reach him if he is still alive, and that was underlined in the original. Finkelkraut actually did survive the war. But you also couldn't be too old. The American Academy wanted men who were old enough to have earned a world-class reputation, but not so old that they were no longer productive. So what was too old? The general rule was to appoint nobody over 55, after Elvin Johnson said of the New School. Now that demarcation was not fixed, yet many scholars were turned away based upon their age. The files of the Emergency Committee, Rockefeller Foundation, and New School contain many examples of scholars who were doomed too old to obtain position. A handwritten note in Hugo Muller's New School folder is simple and to the point. 58 years old and not too important. At the same time, you couldn't be too young. because you then wouldn't have you wouldn't have stature, and you might be competing with American scholars. The not so young criteria, as well as the world-class requirement, had a disproportionate impact on female scholars. Hiring women as professors was a relatively recent phenomenon at European universities, as it was at American ones, so the women who held positions or aspired to academic careers tended to be relatively young. Alvin Johnson's evaluation of Katharina Wolff, a 33-year-old Viennese psychologist, is typical. Despite the excellent testimonials which we have received, she remains a young and promising person rather than one of eminence, Johnson explained to the Rockefeller Foundation. Wolff, in fact, did come to the United States a year later, although not on a non-quota visa, and eventually became a professor at Yale University's Child Study Centers. American universities were sometimes more direct. Charlotte Houtermans, who had a PhD in physics and had studied at the University of Göttingen with luminaries such as Richard Courant, David Hilbert, and James Franck, applied for a physics position at Bennington College. The college wants a man for the position, but it could surely do no harm to try, she was advised. Your training at Göttingen might compensate for your being a woman. It didn't. Houtermans was not considered for the Bennington position and eventually became a physics professor at Sarah Lawrence University College then. You also couldn't be too left. Both community concerns and government pressure prevented socialists or even communists from being hired. At the same time, the scholars could not be too right either. The New Schools files in particular contained many notes suggesting applicants might have not been sufficiently anti-Nazi or anti-Vichy, the collaborationist government in France. But most important, you couldn't be too Jewish. Anti-Semitism marked the American Academy perhaps more than other parts of American life. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, many American universities refused to hire Jews to faculty positions. If they did not ban Jews outright, many departments had an informal one Jew rule. Hiring a refugee scholar, so there'd be one Jew, hiring another would upset that balance, as those weighing applicants indicated. In considering whether to hire Paul Friedlander, John Hopkins President Isaiah Bowman explained his hesitation, and they ended up not hiring him. Dr. Friedlander is the kind of man whom we would like to have at this university, and we cannot say enough in his praise. But his specialty is Greek, and we already have a Jew, Dr. Chermis, in the Department of Greek. We feel that it would be unwise to appoint a second person of the same faith. But more than just not being Jewish, we're not supposed to be too Jewish, which I know might seem like a kind of hard concept to get your idea around. But universities were willing to bend the no Jew rule, for example, or the one Jew rule, as long as the applicant was not too Jewish. Because the German Academy and the Austrian Academy discriminated against Jews even before the rise of Nazism, many aspiring academics converted to Protestantism or Catholicism, or were from families that had. That meant many of the scholars were of Jewish descent, the relevant category for the Nazis, even though they were not practicing Jews or even self-identified as Jews. Now, often universities requested a non-Aryan. Sometimes they were actually said they only would hire pure Aryan, from the pure Aryan category. Hamilton College, for example, noted the requirements for a chemistry professor. The person had to be an outstanding teacher in this country so he could be interviewed, and Aryan. The emergency committee members tossed around several names, all Aryan. No one seemed to consider Hamilton's request for an Aryan out of line. More universities were willing to consider non-Aryans as long as they did not have too much Jewish blood or too many Jewish attributes. Harvard Law School Dean James Landis emphasized the extraordinary difficulty of placing 100% Jews. William D. Harkins from the University of Chicago, who was a chemistry professor, wanted to know whether any of the scholars the department was interested were only remotely Jewish, which would make it very much easier for him to envision possible invitations. This meant much of the correspondence about which scholars to hire consisted of, frankly, unseemly discussions of how Jewish the candidate seemed. Dartmouth President Ernest Hopkins told the Rockefeller Foundation that the university did not want anyone who is obviously Jewish. The foundation then suggested Paul Mantu, whose family had originally been Jewish, but they'd been Catholic for 2 generations. Most people who know him never suspect any Jewish origin, a Rockefeller Foundation official wrote. Hence, he would not appear to fall under the category which President Hopkins has excluded from consideration. Another economic historian, Mark Bloch, who was also a scholar of the first rank, was excluded from consideration. Bloch is more obviously Jewish and is definitely labeled Jewish in France, according to the emergency committee notes about placing him. Dartmouth offered neither Mantu nor Bloch a position. Mantu survived the war. Bloch, who is now considered one of the great economic historians, remained in France and was barred from his position at the Sorbonne after the Nazi occupation. He joined the resistance and was captured and shot by the Gestapo in June 1944, a few weeks after the Normandy invasion. As is to emphasize how not Jewish a particular candidate was, American recommenders stressed that they had not even known the person was Jewish. A chemistry professor at the University of Illinois wrote of Dr. Elsie Hirschberg, and here she is in the middle there with her colleagues, a chemistry professor from Hamburg. She is a Jewess, but I knew her for some years before I knew this. Even though Hirschberg had tried since 1933, she never got a position. And on July 11th, 1942, the 50-year-old was deported from Hamburg to Auschwitz along with her younger sister and perished there. Earl Babbitt, director of the Carnegie Foundation, which also provided some of this funding, wrote of Ernst Grunfeld, a professor at the University of Halle-Wittenberg. His wife, who's not Jewish, tells me that her husband, although he has Jewish blood, was never looked upon as non-Aryan before the accession of Hitler to power. Grunfeld committed suicide in 1938. Occasionally, a recommender felt obligated to acknowledge the refugee scholar did seem too Jewish. Yale law professor Edwin Borchardt praised Arthur Nussberg, who had been in the University of Berlin faculty. One of the finest legal hands now functioning in any part of the world, he noted. He is somewhat Semitic in appearance, but a very delightful person. Nussbaum actually joined the Columbia Law School faculty, where he remained until shortly before his death in 1964. And what of Leonore Brescher, the University of Vienna biologist who studied butterflies? She had many strikes against her. Having been denied a professorship at the University of Vienna in 1926 for anti-Semitic and sexist reasons, Brescher had been pushed into a peripatetic research career that made it difficult for her to be world-class. Her one strong U.S. connection, Leslie Dunn, head of Yale's zoology department, made a few efforts to help her, but ultimately was irritated by her long, meandering letters that could go on for 27 handwritten pages, and attributed her difficulties in getting a position to her personality, though she was an indefatigable worker. Brescher was Jewish, and at 52, approaching the too old category, she was never offered a U.S. position. On September 14, 1942, Brescher boarded a train at Vienna's train station at 7:08 p.m., along with about 1,000 other Jews. She was prisoner 703 on transport 41. 2 days later, the deportees were transferred to freight cars and arrived at 4:30 a.m. at Malotrostanek, an extermination camp in Belarus on the outskirts of Minsk. Only 17 Viennese Jews were known to have survived Malotrostanek. The 55-year-old Brescher was almost certainly among the Jews herded immediately to the open pits in the nearby forest and shot to death. You can't discuss anything about the American response to the Holocaust without noting how much more difficult the American government made it for anyone to immigrate, including scholars. As I mentioned before, and here you can see the entire provision, 4D of the Immigration Act of 1924 said that if you had been continuously teaching for the previous 2 years at a university, before your application for admission, and we're going to continue to carry on the vocation of professor, you could qualify for a non-quota visa along with your wife and unmarried children under 18 years of age. As I mentioned before, all told, only 944 professors and 451 wives and 348 children received non-quota visas between 1933 and 1941, when most immigration from Europe ended. And again, remember, there was no numerical limit on how many non-quota visas could be issued. That's why it was a non-quota visa. And I'm going to mention just a couple of ways, there were many more. The State Department limited the number who could come. As I said, the non-quota visa required that the scholar had taught for previous 2 years prior to immigrating, which presented a perverse problem. By the mid-1930s, most of those trying to immigrate had been expelled from their university positions in 1933, which meant they had not been teaching for at least 2 years immediately preceding the time of their application. As Arthur Korn, whose research led to the invention of the fax machine, wrote in a letter to Harvard astronomer Shapley from Berlin in January of 1939, please do your utmost with your colleagues to influence Washington in a liberal interpretation of the non-quota immigration law. As I had to resign my professorship here on the 7th of January 1936, I could not continue my teaching. It may be taken into consideration that there was not any fault of mine. Sustained lobbying eventually led to a more liberal interpretation in some cases, including Korn's. He obtained a position as professor of electricity at Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey and obtained a non-quota visa for himself and his family. Another interpretive problem that afflicted scholars may have been the most perverse. The law specified that non-quota visas could be issued to a qualifying scholar's wife. State Department officials concluded that because the provision specified wives, it didn't apply to the husbands of female scholars. They stuck to that position, even contributing to the defeat of a congressional bill that attempted to change the language to encompass husbands. In the 1940s, though, the biggest problem refugee scholars face actually came not from universities' hiring practices, but from the State Department. Once the war started, the State Department began scrutinizing the political backgrounds of those applying for non-quota visas even more stringently and began imposing a new criterion for issuing them, admitting only those that they deemed useful to the national defense. The Rockefeller Foundation noted in January 1942 that 25 scholars had American positions waiting for them, but only about 6 had a fair chance of getting in. And one example of the consequences of the State Department policy, the Rockefeller Foundation had agreed to fund Michel Gorlin, a scholar of Russian literature who worked in the University of Paris's library at the New School as professor of comparative Slavonic literature. But the State Department held up his visa for unspecified political reasons. Finally, after constant pestering by his sister, who was in the United States, the New School, and the Rockefeller Foundation, the State Department issued a visa for Gorlin in September 1942 and advised the consul in Lyon to give it to him. At that point, however, the consulate and the New School were not able to reach Gorlin. The reason, just 2 months earlier, on July 17, 1942, Gorlin, who had been imprisoned in an internment camp in France, was deported on Transport 6 to Auschwitz-Birkenau. He died there on September 5th, 1942, at the age of 33. So, in conclusion, among the organizations and even individuals trying to rescue refugee scholars, it was never really resolved whether the best approach was to go after those well worth saving, Many people were rightly tormented by the choices they had to make. But first we have to acknowledge it was a choice. Too often when discussing the American response to the Holocaust, we fall back upon, well, we didn't really know, or we really didn't understand. American academics understood what was happening to their European colleagues. Now you can go overboard in the other direction as well. Just because they knew what was happening didn't make the choices easy. There were genuine economic constraints. Even though the positions were funded, they did have to worry about what would happen to the professors when the money ran out, and this became actually an obsession of the emergency committee. They could hire so few, all were imperiled. It made sense to hire those well worth saving. Still, it's chilling to read the casual dismissals. And these are all direct quotes. Not particularly outstanding, just a routine man. Never published any well-rounded work. Competent and thorough, but not brilliant. An assistant, not a leader. Not a first-rate scientist, but a very nice man. Knowing what rejection meant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leff. We are going to transition to a Q&A. So for those of you that are online, bear with us 1 minute. We'll be right back as we set up.
Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you so much, Laurel, for your talk. I wanted to ask you about your process and how you research this, and also it's journalism, but it's history, and I see there's the organization of American Journalism Historians Association.
Right,
yes.
right.
So if you could talk a bit about your idea for the book, because I thought maybe it came from Max Fleischmann because he started the academic discipline of journalism.
He as a scholarly subject.
Right,
he did,
right.
Yeah, well, a little bit. So my first book, as you mentioned before, was called Buried by the Times, and it was about the New York Times coverage of the Holocaust. And in researching that book, I came across an effort that was done by Carl Friedrich at Harvard University and David Reisman, who then went on to Harvard as a very famous sociologist, but at that point he was a University of Buffalo assistant law professor. And they decided that they were going to help European lawyers and European journalists come to the United States and be retrained at American law schools and American journalism schools. So they started this effort, and in doing the research I'd come across it, I thought it was really interesting, so I started researching more about that, and I did an academic paper on that. But in the course of doing that, I came across many other archives about what Americans, particularly professionals and academics, were doing or not doing in terms of helping similarly situated professionals or academics in Europe immigrate to the United States. So I came across one effort that was made by physicians, and I wrote an article about that. But it seemed to me that the main effort, I'd gotten to the emergency committee in aid of displaced foreign scholars because some of the journalists and certainly the law professors were trying to get academic positions. And then I realized that there were just all of these incredible stories. And I in doing Buried by the Times, I had to work really hard to find out what the New York Times motivation was in terms of
tapping into archives. There wasn't this abundance of information. But when it came to the scholars, there was just an abundance of information. I feel like, there were 6,000, still are 6,000 non-digitized files in the New York Public Library from the Emergency Committee. Mm-hmm. Some of them are kind of thin and don't have interesting stories, but there are hundreds that are bulging. And each one of those has the story of someone's attempt to get out of Europe and the contacts that they made. And then I also found, sort of on the other end, that universities, at least the ones that think a lot of themselves, like Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania and Yale, also have archives of just their deliberations during this time period. So you could go to the Harvard archives, which I did, and look at Harlow Shapley's efforts, and fights, literally, with the Harvard administration to bring over more refugee scholars. So it was really the archives that drew me to the topic, as opposed to with the Times. I started with the question, why did the Times write so many stories about the Holocaust but never put them on the front page? How can I answer that question? And with this one, it was really the archives that gave me the questions and the answers.
Thank you.
So I have a question for you. There's sort of two parts, and one is, Beth, you've organized an event in the spring that's about the role of historically black universities and colleges, HBCUs, in bringing over and sponsoring Jewish academics. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So that did in fact happen. So if you go to the emergency committee files in the New York Public Library, you'll find like Howard University and Fisk University and some of the other HBCUs. It's a little bit of a complicated story because the emergency committee was a little suspicious of this effort, which probably speaks to the time period and how people were viewed. But there was a sense that maybe some of the HBCUs were doing it because they didn't want to have to pay scholars. So this was kind of a way of getting someone for cheap. On the other hand, this also might speak to the humanitarian impulse, which was, we'll get them over here any way we can. They're good teachers. And so there was, in fact, this effort. And as I was telling Beth, at Northeastern, where I used to teach, we did sponsor that. There's a really good film that was made based on the book. And as part of that, the person who introduced the film at the time was still is a law professor at Northeastern who heads up the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project there, which is exploring cold cases from even the earlier period than the 1950s, 1930s, and 1940s. It's something which the journalism school was very involved in. And she had gone to one of these HBCUs in Alabama. And the most important and moving professors that she had were actually some of the European scholars. And I think this is what's said in the book, and I think this was her experience too, her name is Margaret Burnham, is that in some ways because they were snobs, which sort of German scholars tended to be, they were just interested in, can you do the work? Are you qualified? And didn't perceive the African American students the way maybe some of their white colleagues did. So if you could prove yourself and do your work, and they had very high expectations for you, then they treated you very well. So Margaret always talks about the influence these scholars had on her life.
Before I ask another question, I'd like to look out for the people here. Does anyone have a question?
Oh, sure. I'm pretty loud anyways. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was amazing. I'm Dr. Alai. I'm a social psychologist here. And when we talk about genocide in my classes, we always talk about how at its core, it's an identity-based violation. And so I was so struck by when you started to get into the making sure they're not too Jewish, how much that identity feature is so salient. I'm curious if outside of, let's say, the intellectual scholarship or perceptions of that prowess, if there was any other features of identity that might have potentially overridden the quote-unquote Jewishness of that
in American
applicant.
Universities or German universities?
In American universities specifically.
Universities. I mean, first of all, with American universities, you could tell it wasn't quite as blood-based, right? So in Germany, it didn't matter if you didn't, I mean, as a lot of people said, you didn't look Jewish, you didn't talk Jewish, you didn't have typical Jewish attributes. If you had Jewish blood, and there were lots of different laws that defined Jewish blood. The one that affected academics was you had a single Jewish grandparent. That made you non-Aryan. And that's really all that mattered. I mean, there were other scholars who were affected because of the kind of work they did. Maybe they were communists or they were too left or were not willing to cave in as much to the Nazi regime. But the wholesale firings were of anyone who was non-Aryan. In the American context, it wasn't as blood-based, right? So, although they still used the language of the Germans, 100% Jews, are you, Aryan? We want an Aryan, as Hamilton College said. But it was more about, I think, especially in sort of the elite universities, and this was true not just in terms of the refugee context, but in terms of Jews generally. If you could present yourself, and this is where the identity questions come in, if you could present yourself as not seeming too Jewish, and what I think they meant by that is, as I make my hand gestures, hand gestures, appearance, maybe, being from a lower class background, from the Lower East Side. So there might have been a difference between sort of the German Jews who had been here for a while and the more recent immigrants, or the children of more recent immigrants. So if you could present yourself as not Jewish, then some people would overlook you. Although I have to say that, even in the cases of Dartmouth, where they said, well, we'll consider someone not Jewish, and there are other examples like that, they all ultimately ended up not hiring anybody. So, who knows what that means. And I think it's particularly striking in the case of Mark Bloch, because he really, now he's still read because of the economic historical work he did. And he's also a particularly, I think, wrenching case because he had 6 children. Then this also speaks to the immigration standard. You could immigrate with your children who were 18 and were younger than 18. So he had 6 children when he first started his immigration process. 2 of his children were older than 18, and he wasn't willing to leave them. And then things got more desperate for him. He then, is willing to wants to try and get a position. By that time, 2 more of his children had gotten over that age, and ultimately he did. And then it was very late in the process. But that also, I think, is a feature of the immigration law.
Thank you.
We have another question from the audience.
Hi, thank you. I'm also a journalist, and I really enjoyed this talk. I have a question about Albert Einstein, because obviously he was the most famous scholar, but he also was involved with Jewish academia and trying to help. What sort of pressure did he have, and what sort of response did he take on personally as well? Did he actually help for a lot of people to get in? Was Einstein's word worth a lot as well?
He did actually write a lot of letters. I was mentioning also to Beth that, in these archives, every now and then I would see a letter from Albert Einstein, signed by Albert Einstein, and that was very exciting. So he did, if people were in his field, and there were a lot of physicists in the field, and he did it for women too, and mathematicians. So he actually did make a great deal of effort to help those. Now, how much did I saw a lot of cases where there was letters from Albert Einstein and the person still didn't get the position. So it wasn't like, okay, you got Einstein's recommendation, now you'll get a job offer. But he absolutely did write a lot of letters.
And we're dropping in the chat. We did an event about Albert Einstein, actually. I don't know if you were able to attend. No. We just did one, I think about 2 weeks ago, Beth, that you moderated with Michael Shara, who is from the American Museum of Natural History, and he did a huge exhibition about Albert Einstein, specifically talking about his science, but also his role as a humanitarian. So we'll make sure to also get you a copy of that.
Terrific. And where he went, he even though I'm a Princeton grad, he was not actually at Princeton. He was at the Advanced Institute, which was located in Princeton, but not affiliated with Princeton. And the Advanced Institute was one of the academic institutions that probably did it was small, but it did the most in terms of bringing people over. And I think that, if you want to say what influence did he have, he certainly had an influence at the Advanced Institute.
Thank you.
You did say about Esther Kalkin-Brunauer
Yes.
from the American Association of University Women. As you were presenting, you said, ask me about her.
Okay.
So please tell us.
So Esther Kalkin-Brunauer worked for the American Association for University Women. Her position, I can't even remember what it was, but it wasn't necessarily in helping international scholars and trying in immigration in any way. But she had been in Germany in 1933 working on her dissertation, and she was quite affected by what she saw in Germany during this time period. And I should also say that the American Association of University Women was part of an international network of women university professors. And so they had contacts with a group in Czechoslovakia and Germany and Austria. So there was a network that was out there, but she took it upon herself to try and help these women. And I think in some ways for a small institution without a lot of financial backing or connections necessarily, they did really remarkable work. And the saddest thing about this, and this is true of some of the other people as well, is so Brunauer did this work during the war. After the war, she went to work for the State Department. But at some point, as the sort of McCarthy era and the anti-communist effort took over, she was considered an internationalist and a globalist, some of the language that we hear now. She was brought before the House Un-American Activities Committee. She was fired from her position in the State Department. And she had no connections to communist organizations. Her husband was Hungarian, and there were some issues about him, but she had gone through security clearance. He'd gone through security clearances. She'd gone through security clearances, but in the hysteria of the time, and it was her work for refugee scholars that put her in that position. Otherwise, she would have just been an administrator at the Association of University Women. And so just to see, and there were a couple other people in that position, just to see how things turned and the courageous good work that these people did during this period was then used against them after the war was really, it was kind of hard to take, to be honest.
So I have another question for you.
Okay, then I thought there were,
Yep. So there's this organization called Scholars at Risk that exists now. And, in conversations with other scholars in Holocaust and genocide studies, there's been a lot of conversation about historically scholars trying to come here. And some of the challenges that you mentioned still occur, but even without funding or having to, I think that there were conversations, for example, with scholars coming out of Afghanistan who also
and
then,
Turkey.
and Turkey, and then having to also provide them support to
Ukraine.
Get acclimated here, to find housing for them, and there wasn't a lot of funding available. I'm curious what you see happening now, both with people coming to the States and also the exodus of academics now.
Well, that's a whole new phenomenon. That was not ever happened before. The Scholars at Risk, I should say that their program actually comes out of the Emergency Committee of Displaced Foreign Scholars, the institution which housed the Emergency Committee, because as the name suggests, this was just supposed to be, it lasted 12 years, but it was supposed to be just for this particular emergency. But the institution that housed them went on to sort of take on the mission and then formalized it as the Scholars at Risk program about maybe 2 decades ago. They have been, as you said, helping people in Afghanistan and in Turkey, Syria, and other places where scholars were endangered. It's the numbers aren't as big. Well, I think they have, in the period that they've existed, have helped 800 scholars. So that's not bad. But there isn't sort of an outflow in the same way and for the same reason as there was in the 1930s and the 1940s. And I don't know what to say about America. I mean, it's just America was the beacon, right? I mean, and interestingly, before the United States was the beacon, Germany was the beacon for academics. I mean, some of this happened, and some of these academics got involved in this effort because they had studied at German universities, because German universities were considered, the best in the world. And by the 20th century, the United States universities had sort of taken that over, but German universities were considered to be great. But then, the United States got that mantle in the 20th century, and we have held on to it. And that's all I'll say till now.
So I'll take one more question.
Can you recall?
Or two more questions.
Okay, two more questions.
May I ask, we'll give you the microphone so you can, actually we need it for the recording, otherwise no one will be able to
So why don't we
hear you.
start with oh, okay.
If you don't use the mic, the people on Zoom can't hear you.
Right.
That's why.
Well, actually, so we're going to have the gentleman in the back. We're going to have him ask a question first.
Can I still ask?
We're going to have him start, and then we'll come to you.
Hi, my name is Josiah Carrera. I'm a student here at QCC. You asked a similar question, but I just wanted a little more context. If a similar crisis were to happen now, God forbid, do you think universities would make the same moral compromises?
That's a really good question, a really hard question. I mean,
I don't want to put you on the spot.
no, I'm
you know?
thinking about it.
Yeah.
I don't feel on the spot. I think it is a really good and really important question. I'm just really thinking about, I think probably they would make the same kind of compromises, is what I would have to say. I mean, it's the inability to get outside the framework. I tried to express this in my talk, but seeing these notes and seeing the discussions that they were having, it felt like I was at a faculty meeting, right? The same things they say about scholars now, and it's like, okay, but if you don't make this person a job offer, they're gonna die, and you know that, and you're still saying the things that you're saying, without the willingness to even sort of, and I don't want to say everybody was like this, and one of the things you do notice in the records is that there are many individual scholars at individual places who committed themselves to doing this work for no apparent reason, meaning that they were not Jewish themselves, they didn't have any particular connection to Germany or to a certain kind of scholarship, and they just felt obligated to do that. So there were people, individuals, and I could go through and name them because they're so frequently in the files, and they're so frequently saying this has totally taken over my life. And you can tell, but given the number of letters, everybody wrote letters then, right? There were no quick emails or text. This was all letters and maybe occasional, wire cable. But the general response, certainly the university response was, this is a problem. It's a problem we don't want to deal with. If we can avoid dealing this problem, we will. If we have a particularly annoying faculty member like Harlow Shapley at Harvard, then we'll have to maybe do something because he's particularly annoying and keeps after us. But if we can just ignore this, maybe it will go away. And it's hard not to see contemporary, particularly university presidents and deans taking the same posture.
Okay,
Maybe
thank
they
you.
have taken the same posture.
So we'll come to you.
Can you recall a trained academic demission and physician of the traditional framework, who not psychiatry or genetic modification of the era, who was admitted into U.S. university faculty.
Yes, because I did so there was actually, there were very many academics, Jewish academics or non-Aryan academics in German medical schools. I mean, it was actually a fairly high proportion. It was high enough that the emergency committee set up a special committee just for medical scientists and placed, I think they ended up placing 150 doctors, including at Harvard. I mean, one of the things when I wrote about the effort that physicians made, the dean of the Harvard Medical School, again, is sort of one of these people who took this upon himself, the early dean. He stopped being dean in 1935, and actually he ended up placing about 10 people on the Harvard, in different Harvard medical departments. But, you know, there was, again, the sort of the humanitarian impulses versus other impulses came into play as well. Because one of the things that happened, and this was after, his name was David Edsel, was no longer dean at the Harvard Medical School, by the late 1930s, there was, you know, as I described, the situation got worse, more people desperate to immigrate, clearer what was going to happen to people who weren't able to emigrate. One of the things that one of the founders of the emergency committee, who was himself a physician, he was at the Rockefeller Institute, which is not the Rockefeller Foundation, he wanted to get universities like Harvard Medical School to put people on, you know, have them have a medical school affiliation, even when they had offers from the Brigham or Mass General, or, you know, they had jobs, but in order to get a non-quota visa, they needed an affiliation with a medical school, and the president of Harvard would not do that, and the other medical schools would not do that. And again, it was like, we're not paying this person, you just have to give them the affiliation, and they wouldn't do it. They in fact turned down a Nobel laureate who went to NYU, but so he survived, but they turned down a Nobel laureate. Does that answer? Was that the question you were asking? Yeah.
So we want to thank everybody for coming, everybody who's on Zoom, everybody who's going to watch in the future. And Laurel, I want to thank you so much, because this is so much work that you did. And, you know, the book, when you read the book, it kind of overwhelmed me with the depth of your research and the importance of the work that you've done, because these people's names get saved, they get preserved, we get to remember them.
Yeah, I mean, I love, frankly, one of the reasons I like doing these presentations is that you can see the people. I mean, and actually, when I first started, there were fewer and fewer photos. One of the great things about the internet is more and more photos are showing up there. So you could see what Leonore Brescher looks like. You can see what Ludwig Berwald. I mean, I had not found him when I wrote the book. And so I think it's very important to see their faces and see that they were people and not just, you know, people writing these desperate letters. So thank you for letting me do this. I appreciate it.
Thanks to everyone for joining us today. We hope you stay safe and be well.